Wrong floor. Went to the wrong floor. I beat you by 30 seconds.
I now wish to welcome Mr. Shaler and Mr. Watson from the National Association of Steel Framed Housing and Mr. Crittenden from the Welding Technology Institute of Australia. And gentlemen, for the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Mr. John Shaler, I'm here as National President of NASH, which is the National Association of Steel Framed Housing.
Ken Watson, Executive Director of the National Association of Steel Framed Housing.
Geoff Crittenden, CEO of the Welding Technology Institute of Australia.
Okay, and thank you for appearing before the committee today. And I invite you to make a brief opening statement, should you wish to do so, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay.
So, who would like to go first? Okay. Mr. Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. NASH would like to thank the committee for inviting us here today to discuss the future of the Australian steel industry. The National Association of Steel Framed Housing, more commonly known as NASH, represents the interest of the cold-formed steel fabrication industry in the residential and low-rise commercial construction markets, which is one of the downstream processing industry segments required for the steel to be used in the Australian market. NASH is an industry association with over 80 members from around Australia and New Zealand. Members include steel manufacturers and distributors, component and fastener suppliers, steel frame fabricators and builders, engineers and building designers. Whilst there is a number of large companies providing sustaining membership to our association, the majority of the members are small to medium enterprises located in regional areas of Australia. The industry has sales in the order of $500 million annually, with a direct national workforce of over 2,500 people. NASH has been very active in developing standards for the industry, and these have now been referenced in the National Construction Code. The writing of these standards has required us to work collaboratively with universities and the CSIRO to develop innovative, cost-effective solutions which are easy to use and makes the industry more competitive against its competitors both domestically and internationally. These standards have been used as a model for standards in New Zealand and South Africa and commonly used as the basis of design in Asia. Australia is seen around the world as a leader in the design and construction of steel frame buildings using cold-formed steel. The technological basis for this has been led by BlueScope, with the support from many universities and industry associations around Australia. Due to this leading technology, Australian companies are exporting products and technology overseas, particularly to Southeast Asia and African regions. These technologies include the use of high-strength steels and the development and application of sophisticated CAD/CAM systems to manufacture steel frames. Recently, the overseas countries have been catching up with their technology and in some cases surpassing Australia's leading position. For Australia to remain a world leader, the industry needs the ongoing investment of the government in the research and development areas, together with ongoing technology transfer to SMEs. In addition, the SMEs need assistance with growing their businesses. The training of apprentices is another vital area for the ongoing success of the industry. NASH would again like to thank you for the opportunity to attend today to discuss the future of the steel industry and in particular the future of the downstream businesses within the industry. We look forward to the following discussions and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Crittenden, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Senator. The Welding Technology Institute of Australia represents welding in Australia. Our corporate members vary from, at one end, the AGLs and the BHPs of the world, down to small mum and dad fabricator shops. Our individual members, again, at one end we have academics, material scientists and engineers, and at the other, welders. Welding is a science, it's an engineering discipline, it's a trade, and for those of you who have ever tried welding, it's also an art form. We call it an enabling technology, which means that it is the preferred method for sticking metal together. And that means at one end it's fundamental to the manufacture of submarines, ships, mining infrastructure, energy infrastructure, cars. It's also fundamental for the manufacture of cochlear implants and biotechnology devices. In my submission, I tried to make the point of how important steel is strategically to Australia. In simple terms, we have 2.4 billion tonnes of steel in this country. Hard to see when you drive around Canberra or Sydney, but fly over the Pilbara or the Northern Territory or far north Queensland, as I'm sure many of you have, and you see acres and acres of steel infrastructure. Our roads are full of steel infrastructure, rail systems. Our defence relies on steel infrastructure. The only way to repair and maintain that steel infrastructure is through welding. So welding is fundamentally important to the strategic interests of Australia. Currently, 30% of fabricated steel used in Australia is fabricated overseas. If we were to look at major energy infrastructure projects, so for example the INPEX gas fields in Northern Territory, the WestConnex motorway in Sydney, that will be nearer 90% of that steel, fabricated steel, has been imported. From our best estimate, talking to our members, something like 75% of the steel imported into this country, fabricated steel, doesn't meet Australian standards. So if you were to go to fabrication shops in Darwin at the moment, you'd find their yards full of modules that have come in from Korea. They go into, having been inspected, they go into the shop, they're cut up and they're re-welded. Why is this happening? It's because we find that there are silicon welds in structures. Silicon weld is where you tack weld at two ends of a run and you fill it with no more gaps. You find that there are safety ladders with all the rungs at different intervals. You find that there are safety rails on flame towers that are just tack welded. There are no material data sheets for any of the steel. So a lot of the fab shops in Darwin are literally cutting it up and putting it back together again. The outcome is not a satisfactory solution, but it is a solution, and it, by and large, is cheaper than getting it done properly in the first place. But the long-term life cycle of the project is going to be more expensive. If we look at bridges, in West Australia, there's a bridge which we've inspected and the Steel Institute have inspected. And this bridge runs between a primary school and a high school. And in our view, and the view of all of the technical experts that have viewed it, it is unsafe. It certainly doesn't meet any structural welding standards. When we took a crew from the ABC there to film it, our man in West Australia decided to jump up and down the bridge to show how unsafe it was. And that was the last he saw of the film crew, who were seen heading for the side. There was a bridge recently in Penrith in New South Wales that when it was designed, a design deflection of 10 millimetres, they discovered soon after it was installed that it had a deflection of 60 millimetres. Bridge was made in Vietnam. When they cut it up, they found that the main structural trusses were filled with water because they had been made of the incorrect grade of steel, and to get the weight right, they'd filled them with water. The our fabricators could be the best in the world, but they're not. And one of the reasons they're not the best in the world is that their margins are running at 3%. If your margin is at 3%, it's difficult to invest in training and robotics and make you the best in the world. So Europeans are running at about 7 man-hours per tonne processing steel. Our best fabricators with robotics are running at 10 to 12. The average guys are running at 15 to 20. So we need the opportunity to invest in training and in robotics. So is there a solution? Yes, there is, and that is that everything that's used in Australia, every piece of fabricated steel erected in Australia needs to comply with Australian standards. If that happens, then we're all working on a level playing field. And that will give everybody a fair chance. I'm not here to ask for a special treatment for the fabrication industry, simply that we all comply to the same set of rules. Before I finish, because I don't want to go on for too long, I would say that I'd like to answer Senator Carr's question. Earlier, he asked Ariam whether, by changing the policy settings, government could actually make an impact on the steel industry in Australia. And I wanted to answer it then, Senator, but the answer is clearly yes. I mean, that is what we're here for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, before...
Start there. What precisely would you want public policy to reflect? What specific measures do you want to see put in place?
I'd want to see regulation that meant that every piece of fabricated steel imported into this country or manufactured in this country complied to the appropriate standards for pressure vessels and structural steel.
Well, on that issue, you've mentioned a couple of examples on notice. Would you be able to provide us with details of where substandard steel has been used in projects which would constitute a public safety risk?
If I'm protected by parliamentary privilege,
You
I
are.
can, Senator.
That's the whole point.
I'm happy to do that.
That's why these inquiries are here, to provide you with that protection.
Yep.
It's a statement that's made on a regular basis. But when it comes to specific instances, people are somewhat more reluctant. So I think if there are specific instances that you can point to, especially where there's a public safety issue involved, then I think this committee would be particularly interested. Now, so you're prepared to do that?
Certainly am, Senator.
Thank you. Now, could I ask you, if there are circumstances where bridges, for instance, and I think you mentioned bridges,
Yes.
are being produced which clearly are in breach of the standards and do constitute a public safety risk, how has that occurred? Why is that happening?
Okay. I guess that it occurs because the people that are determining procurement policy don't understand technical matters in relation to welding, and bearing in mind that welding standards are critical in a bridge. And also that the people that they contract to don't understand the Australian standards. They may be working to Korean standards, Chinese standards, American standards, and any standard. And the problem with welding is that you've got to watch it actually being done. You can't unweld it once it's done. So, you know, unless you actually stand over somebody and watch them when they're welding, it's very easy to take shortcuts, and a lot of companies are under pressure to take shortcuts. So, so if you, for example, we're working on a bridge at the moment in West Australia. If that bridge was being manufactured in Kwinana, they would have regular visits from the client, the contractor, from us. They would have milestones. Every single safety aspect of every Australian standard will be applied to that bridge. If it's being manufactured in Shanghai, then you just don't get the same level of oversight. And you know, we actually have a consulting business that goes to China and actually does this sort of oversight. And unless you do it, you just don't get the same same degree of safety.
I can see that line of argument. I'll just reveal that my father was a Boilermaker welder, and I was brought up with the grand tradition of the DLI ticket and long discussions about the way in which inspections used to occur. Now, is that not happening? Are you suggesting that the regulatory authorities in this country aren't undertaking the necessary inspections and auditing?
What regulatory authorities, Senator?
Well, I see. So, but is that always been the case?
No, we just have, I mean, we don't have any regulations which determine whether something's safe or not. There are some pressure vessel inspection regulations, But we rely, I mean, industry self-regulation is the term. We rely on engineers signing off on bridges, on structures. Engineers aren't always qualified in welding processes. They rely on the fabricator to ensure that the building is, that the structure is made to the appropriate Australian standard. If it's made overseas, it quite often isn't.
Can't be. But is the training mechanisms or the training circumstances in the country changed to that extent that our welders aren't producing the quality work?
The standard of our welders has deteriorated dramatically over the last 20 years. Since we moved away from having welders and boilermakers to heavy and light fabricators. A heavy fabricator comes out of TAFE, they've got three choices. They can do the basic welding module, the intermediate welding module, or the advanced welding module. And that means that you can get a guy who's a heavy fabricator and he'll say he's a welder and he got the most beautiful CV. As an example, Thales are members of ours. I was talking to them the other day. They needed 20 welders to do some repairs on an Anzac frigate. They don't keep welders on staff the whole time, so they get them through a labour hire company. And they brought 20 welders in, they tested them. 3 passed the test. It's about $1,000 a test, so $20,000, 3 welders. In Stanwell Power Station, they spent $80,000 a year testing welders. BMA Coal Loader in Rocky, they spend $45,000 a year testing welders for every single repair they have to do. Simply the quality is not there, and the Institute is setting up a national qualification scheme now because we need to do something about this. We need to effectively reintroduce the trade of welder into Australia. And sorry, just to say one thing, the Institute, we have a lot of TAFE teachers in the Institute and we work very closely with them. But what's happening to TAFEs around the country is criminal.
So there is a question there about the declining training standards and the regulator there in terms of the vocational education system in the country. You're saying the move to competency-based training has in fact led to incompetence.
Yes, it has. It basically moved the responsibility for training from TAFE, i.e. the government, to industry. So what happens is that, you know, when they come out, they're of a very, very low standard, and industry then has to train them up. Now, it's fine if you've got money and you can put enough apprentices on and you can develop them and bring them in. But when business is hard and you've got no work, you don't have apprentices going through the system and they don't get the opportunity to really learn anything. So that's when they rock up to shutdowns on power stations or mines with really no experience of how to do the welding. And if you've ever seen, maybe you don't, but if you ever get the chance to see welders working in a power station doing boiler tubes, I mean, it's a highly skilled activity.
Yes. Well, I might turn to the National Association of Steel Framed Housing. In terms of the current building code, are there limitations on the use of steel in the building code?
Generally there aren't any. Our standards, our industry standards are now referenced in the building code. So that overcomes a lot of troubles. There are some limitations on high-rise buildings, on middle-rise, where the building code is quite prescriptive. And for example, it says load-bearing walls shall be concrete or masonry. And we were actually talking to the Australian Building Codes Board today about changing some of these prescriptive type regulations that stop the use of new and innovative materials.
Steel, you put steel into that category?
Yes, like the high strength steels are quite new and very innovative, yeah.
Now, is there an issue here about the use of substandard steel in buildings?
In our types of buildings, about 80 to 90% of our members or tonnage throughput is using BlueScope steel. They're quite loyal, and as a consequence, that isn't a major issue for us. There are some issues with square hollow sections that we use that are imported, particularly on the coating side of items. When people think that galvanised steel is one product, but you can get thicknesses from say 5 microns up to 30 microns, and that gives you a lot different life in the building.
Yes.
I mean, if I can sort of add something there, I mean, our light gauge steel industry is predominantly where the technology is in the coating. So zinc aluminum steel that we use. You know, currently, as Ken said, you know, over 80% of the industry uses local manufactured steel. But you know, if there wasn't a local manufacturing alternative, then we get some
We
real
were
issues.
advised when the committee was in Wollongong that there have been instances of Chinese manufacturers imitating BlueScope steel products. Are you familiar with that?
I am aware that there has been some cases of that.
Fraudulently presenting something as someone else's product.
Well, I couldn't give exact details, but yeah,
But you're aware of the claim?
Yes, correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you don't know how common it is?
Not off the top of my head, no. But I mean, as I said, we have heard claims that people who are using not local manufactured steel.
Have you ever seen an example of it?
I certainly have seen overseas steel in the marketplace, yes.
Yes, but claiming, or that it gives you the appearance that it's BlueScope steel.
No, I haven't seen anything claiming to be BlueScope steel that's been substituted. We've seen imported steels. One of the issues we've had with getting test certificates from overseas, that I got some overseas steel test certificates to see whether it was compliant from one member, and it was missing the basic information like who made the steel and looked like it just been typed in the...
But counterfeit certificate.
Basically, it was a counterfeit certificate.
Well,
yeah.
there's a specific instance we were given of the Colorbond, which is, you know, is a very successful product. That advice was tendered, particularly because I bought a lot of Colorbond recently. I was quite disturbed to hear this, that it actually may not be BlueScope Colorbond that has the appearance of BlueScope Colorbond.
That could be correct. I mean, we don't have a lot of to do with metal sheet roofing, and we're involved in the actual structure of the house.
Yes, I understand that.
But it certainly would be it would be the case with Colorbond roofing, where they all look the same, basically.
All right, well, can I ask both of you then, finally, what do you want to see the government do in terms of a steel industry plan? Do you want to see a steel industry plan?
Yes, we'd like to see a steel industry plan, and I think what we'd like to see is support of the industry, all sides, particularly on the technology side and the research and development side, so we can develop new products to stay ahead of the import competition. We're up there leading the world now. In addition, the industry needs assistance. Like, we're dealing with a lot of SMEs, and they're very entrepreneurial, but getting them to move up to the next level and to survive in a tough market, that they need assistance. And the other one is training of apprentices is very important. But we've got the same troubles that you were indicating earlier. We use a lot of carpentry apprenticeships, and we've had steel included in the carpentry courses. But with a lot of private RTOs in the business, some of the training is questionable, and there's a lot of pressure on everybody to tick off that a person's competent, whether they are or not. So that's some of the things. I don't know if John would like to add anything more?
Yes, we would like to see a national steel plan, Senator. We'd like to see regulation that enforced the application of Australian standards to all fabricated steel erected in Australia. We'd like to see a positive procurement plan that favoured Australian steel and Australian fabricators. And finally, like Nash, we'd like to see something done about training. My board's most serious concern is the way that the TAFE is losing resources, and it's a serious problem for everybody in industry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Edwards.
No, I'm pretty good. You can...
Okay. Well, before I go to Senator Xenophon, I might just ask a couple of things. Firstly, earlier on today, the Australian Steel Institute has called for a royal commission into steel-related manufacturing industry, and I just wanted to get your thoughts about whether you feel that the state of the industry is such that a Royal Commission is warranted.
From our perspective, I would support that request, Senator. I have been preaching for the last 12 months that I think we're in a war for survival, and we need all the help we can get. I mean, seriously, within 5 years we might not have a steel industry or a fabricator in Australia. Currently, there was a recent incident where there was a problem in Northern Territory with some imported pipe. They just brought Korean welders in on 457s for 2-week stints. They fixed it up and they brought the next crew in. We're in serious trouble. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Mr.
I
Watson?
think yes, we would.
Okay.
As much as we currently, as we said, have a majority of our members use Australian steel, very concerning if there wasn't an industry here, and it would affect our industry in general downstream if it wasn't here, in research and development, in the price, margin creeping, or in certification of steels coming in. So there's a range of issues that would affect our industry. So yes, we would be in favour of that.
Thank you. Now, before I go to Senator Edwards, I would just want to return to a point that was made, which seems to illustrate something of a false economy going on here, where fabrication that's coming in from overseas is having to be checked and then reworked in order to bring it up to Australian standards. And as a layperson in this area, although I do have two brothers who are boilermakers, so I know something about the nature of what we're talking about, but it seems to me that there's something wrong when we have Australian standards and we are requiring other overseas fabricators surely we are requiring them to comply with Australian standards, and if they're not, and if they don't understand our standards, as you said, Mr. Crittenden, that's their job. That's what they're getting paid for. They should be required to understand what our standards are, and that's the first part of that question. And then there's surely public liability issues, particularly with bridges, etc., where if it is found that something's been fabricated and it doesn't meet Australian safety standards, then there are some serious insurance issues there. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Senator. In the case of the bridge in West Australia, we told the local government that we thought the bridge was unsafe. They said it wasn't. We told the West Australian government we thought the bridge was unsafe. They said it wasn't. It's the business of the local council. The children still cross the bridge every day, every school day. Perhaps I can give you another example. We did a job for a major mining company in Western Australia where they had contracted a major Korean industrial conglomerate to build a whole load of bridges for a railway. Those bridges were required to be built to standard 1554 Part 3, which gives it basically a 100-year cycle life. So it's a very high standard, ideal for bridges that are taking a lot of constant fatigue loading. So they built it to 1554 Part 1, which is the lowest part of the standard not normally used for bridges. So those bridges, I think were 5 of them, had to be completely reworked to bring them up to the standard to make them safe. This is the sort of issue that happens. Once you sort of throw away responsibility to an overseas fabricator, and if you don't watch the whole thing, it's easy for there to be problems. Language problems, cultural problems, and little things like in legal documents in the contract, to be built to Australian standard or equivalent. Well, what does that mean? And that's, you see that in contracts. And we had a case the other day where a combination of a British and Italian joint venture building a bridge. The client had asked us to edit the specification, which we had done, and it came back from the project managers with a little change, which was to be built to Australian standard 1554 or AWS American standard D1.1. So basically what they were doing is they built it to any standard you like. So parts of it could be built to 1554, parts to D1.1. It would make the whole bridge totally unsafe. And this is the sort of thing that's happening. And welding is it may appear to be a simple trade, but it's a highly technical business, And people make these little things, and the only way you can guarantee safety is you select a standard and you stick to it. You know, you can build to D1.1. The American standard, it's a very good standard, but you have to build to D1.1. You can't say, we'll build this bit to ISO, this bit to Australian, and this bit to American. It doesn't work like that.
So what happens in a case where you've drawn attention to public authorities about a bridge? They say it's safe, and I take it the bridge is still up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you still maintain the view that it's unsafe?
Yeah.
What do you expect will happen?
Well, what I expect will happen is eventually that it'll get so rusty that they'll take it down. What I don't want to happen is for a bunch of
Kids to be up there when it falls down.
well, there was a case in Israel, you may remember, where exactly the same thing happened. The way to knock that bridge over will be to get
A lot of Australian athletes were on that bridge at the time.
That's right. You know, the way to knock it down will be to get a football team on there with a couple of beers inside them and make them decide that they're all going to jump up and down in time.
Maybe you don't want to tell people how to do it.
Okay.
Well, I would further suggest, Senator Carr, that, I mean, this is very serious. I mean, we should highlight this evidence to the stakeholders involved and for them to answer that.
Sorry, further to...
Certainly in our report.
It will be in our report, but I think given the gravity...
The correspondence might be...
Just, can I just ask a supplementary to that?
Yes.
Directly on what Senator Edwards just said.
No,
So this is your Busselton, this is Busselton.
Yes, Senator.
That's right, which we've had a meeting on, which
Yes, we have.
a number of months ago.
Yes.
You raised it, you went public on it. I think it was highlighted on the 7:30 program
Yes, it
on the
was.
ABC. You're still getting ignored despite the sort of the naming and shaming.
That's it.
Yep.
That's
We've
it.
repeatedly told them it's unsafe and they tell us it is safe.
Okay. Could you provide all that, the chain of correspondence and the emails to this committee, and the committee can then decide whether to write to the authorities? I think Senator Edwards' suggestion is a very good one. If you could help us with that, that would be...
Certainly, Senator.
They'll either do something or ignore us as well, but I think that the more people that they ignore, if something does go wrong...
The more their insurers will deny them.
yes. There's nothing like that to focus them on.
Yes, that's right.
But there's a serious public safety question here. I mean, put aside any of these matters, the legal liability question, there's a question of public safety. That's the thing that really disturbs me.
You're absolutely right, Senator, which is why it's important that we set these standards. We can't walk away from regulation. We can't leave industry to set its own standards. We have to have regulation which says if you're going to erect a bridge, safety barriers. I'll give you another example. It was last year, I think, one of the light poles came down on the Anzac Bridge in Sydney. Nobody was hurt. But if the light pole had fallen on a car or an individual, it would just have killed somebody. And it was been improperly installed. The steel had all rusted around the bottom, and the thing had just fallen over. Look at all the gantries you see on freeways around the country. If they're built in Australia, the gantries are pretty good. If they've just been brought in and dropped in, nobody has any idea of what might happen. A gantry comes down on somebody's car. There's endless numbers of public safety issues. The main roads and departments in Australia they've gone to a completely separate standard, a specification. And if you want to get in most states, if you want to get a gantry up, you have to be a pre-qualified fabricator, you have to use Australian steel, it has to be inspected, there are milestones that go through it, the erection is supervised, you know, it's pretty good. But if in other places like WestConnex, China Bow got a lorry which goes around and fits the stuff up, not managed by Main Roads, New South Wales.
So doing... Sorry, Sean.
I think Senator Edwards has the call, but
I think I pitched it off Senator Carr.
no, Senator Carr's...
Oh, right.
finished, so-
No,
okay.
I think It's incredible.
Go on.
Yeah,
on that
I mean,
line.
supplementary to what my colleagues have been asking about. So all this, one of the questions I put to previous witnesses in terms of, to ARIAM, to the Australian Steel Institute, is in terms of a decent procurement policy that not only includes economic benefits rather than lowest cost, which doesn't take into account local economic benefits, compliance, the issues that you've been raising, but also the whole of life cost, because that's something that the South Australian Industry Advocate doesn't yet do, and that's not a criticism because I think they do a lot of terrific work, Mr Nightingale and his team. But is that something that should be included? Because it seems to me your sector, particularly, Mr Crittenden, you may want to comment on this, Mr Watson, Mr Shaler, if you take into account the whole of life costs, the longevity and the maintenance costs of a piece of equipment, that would surely, you'd think that would be of benefit to Australian steel fabricators.
You're absolutely right, Senator. Build quality does have an enormous effect on the longevity, the whole of life costing of a project, and we're finding that now as we're being called in by the big miners to repair a lot of their infrastructure because they're driving it hard and it's falling apart. I heard the other day of sorry to keep telling you these stories, but it's a good way to explain it, of a conveyor, a coal conveyor that was been imported in from China, and 2 months after it was put down, literally the whole thing fell apart. Whole of life costing is important, and you need quality, but if it's built to the Australian standard, it's fine. I mean, they're not an issue with it, but procurement people don't think about that. They talk about, they want the lowest price. They talk about value, but often they don't really understand it. And with the greatest respect of where I am, if many of the public servants who work for governments around the country, they talk about value and how important it is to get the best value out of taxpayers' dollar. Well, that's true, but that's never going to be by taking the cheapest price. You've got to look at the whole of life costing of the product.
If you've already raised this issue of boron in steel, has that been discussed?
I haven't discussed
Okay,
that.
so can just very quickly, you've raised with me personally, and when I went to your conference last year, the issue of boron in steel, which I understand that imported steel has boron in it. It's okay for some forms of steel, but for other forms of steel, it makes welding very problematic and indeed dangerous. How can we tell what tests are there, what compliance mechanisms are there to make sure that steel, there isn't boron in steel which requires welding, because that's a real issue, isn't it?
The issue is not actually the boron in the steel, as you say. Boron is used for high-strength steels. It's the issue of knowing that the boron's in the steel. And so we recommend that if you have to test the steel now, because a lot of imported steel has boron in without being noted on the material data sheet. If it's not, if you don't know it's there, what can happen when you weld it is you can get brittleness, and then it'll fall apart. And so we've advised all our members that you have to do a proper test to ensure that you understand the chemical composition. You can't trust an imported material data sheet. We've seen so many forged material data sheets, it's not funny. So you have to test it, and if it's got more than 8 parts per million, you need to seek advice on it when you weld it. It's a simple thing. The thing is, though, if you don't know it's there, and you're a mum and dad fab shop and you just weld it up, then you've got trouble coming down the track.
Senator, can I just add to the life cycle issue? It certainly is if you follow the Australian standards, and that Australian standards, development of those standards takes into account those sort of issues. So longevity of the product, when they set up the standards, say for steel or in our case, our standards. So it certainly is a very important issue. For the light gauge steel industry, we build houses basically and low-rise structures. It's something you can't see, so it gets hidden behind a whole range of claddings and coatings and other things. So you don't have the confidence that the steel is going to last 50 years. Or in general terms, the building industry works to a 7-year warranty cycle, but effectively the local steel manufacturer
36 years for Colorbond.
offers a 50-year warranty. Now, I mean, what happens behind that wall, you don't know. So if your steel is a substandard steel from overseas, who knows what's happening behind the wall.
So just finally, Mr. Crittenden and Mr. Watson, Mr. Shaler, do you think it's inevitable that we will see through defective steel, substandard steel, not complying with the Australian standards, that it poses a real risk to public safety? That is it dumb luck that we haven't had a major accident today?
When we were seeing a huge amount of steel and fabricated steel that doesn't meet the Australian standard, I wouldn't say it was dumb luck. I would say that most of the industry is aware that there are issues and they're looking out for them. But in my view, and I hate to say this, that there's inevitability that someone's going to get killed because something's going to fall apart that shouldn't have fallen apart.
I mean, we're not involved in heavy structural area, but certainly in our area, it will be warranty issues and other things that cost, the consumer money to repair or fix. Possibly, in a situation where there might be a double or triple storey structure, there could be a collapse, but certainly there is a possibility of that.
But we definitely see more maintenance coming in because of these issues, and minor failures that are causing a lot of grief to the homeowner and the owners of the thing. Like in New Zealand, they had their leaky building syndrome, and that costs their industry billions.
What's that, leaky building?
It's a bit leaky buildings syndrome because of their building regulations and poor interpretation with lightweight cladding. Water got in and effectively rotted out the timber frames behind it, and that costs the New Zealand government and community billions of dollars to go in and fix. And that's the trouble in housing in particular, and other light frames and construction that's hidden. And so by the time you find you've got an issue, you're talking about very expensive fixes to make the building safe again.
Thank you.
Can I just ask about structural steel in the high-rise area? And I've heard reports, I'm not going to mention the name of a particular building on the Gold Coast. There have been reports of a fairly significant building there rusting, and that's some years ago. Obviously, being on the sea, there's additional pressure on steel. Do you have concerns about the quality of steel that's being used in those sort of situations?
Yes, Senator. Interestingly enough, we use very little steel in high-rise buildings in Australia. We're running at about 19%, and the global average is 50%. So most of our high-rise buildings are reinforced concrete. But if you have a situation where you're getting rusting, there's clearly two elements to it. Firstly, the coatings are not up to the required standard, and we're finding that what's happening at the moment is that steel is being procured from overseas. It's actually being surface coated overseas as well. So it comes in, it may be galvanised and it may be painted. So from a cursory inspection, when you erect it, you may not know that it's not adequate. And like with everything else, it's not what you put on top, it's how you prepare it before you put it on top. So you can easily get issues with that. In the construction industry, we know that there are a number of instances of imported steel that hasn't met the standard and is not properly fabricated and so on.
I mean, just to add on Geoff's comments about concrete structures, I mean, concrete structures are full of steel as well.
That's right.
Full of reinforcing steel. So, there's the quality of the reinforcing also is an issue as well. So, certainly, it's a coating issue really on high-rise buildings where if the environmental environment that steel is used in is if the steel's not properly coated or protected, then you will get issues. There's standards about that, Ken, I think, isn't there?
Yes, there's standards about it. And like lightweight steel framing is used on the top of these buildings, and we're concerned with imported steel, you really don't know what your coating is. For our standards, we tried to get information from some of the newer coatings about how they performed in real life, and the suppliers were unable to give us that information so that we could include those types of coatings within our standards.
There's one thing BlueScope have certainly provided is their quality control on coatings of light gauge steel is very, very good. And we rely on that for our the longevity of our structures that we build and our members build. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I don't think there's any further questions, so thank you for appearing before us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, look, I neglected to ask if you, and I just want to double check you don't have any amendments to make to your submissions?
No,
No, okay. Okay, thank you very much.
okay, thank you.
And I now welcome Mr. Waters, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Lusink.